Okay, we're going to move on with our Unit 1 anatomy. We're now going to, if you're following along on the anatomy guide, we're going to move into the ventral cavity. So please recall that the ventral cavity is all that internal space in your chest and then on down into your abdominopelvic cavity area. And so we're going to divide that big giant major ventral cavity up into sections, and we're going to do the thoracic cavity first. So I've got a view from visible body here ready to go. We're going to have to do some dissection though here to see some of the features. I want to take this and rotate it upward for a second. This is kind of a cool view because there I'm going to highlight in blue, there's your diaphragm muscle. And if I rotate it this way and kind of rotate it around, you can really see it has like a parachute or an umbrella shape to it. And what happens is when you're going to inhale, the diaphragm contracts and it actually flattens out like this. That allows your thoracic cavity to increase in size, which allows air to flow into your lungs. So that's what happens during an inhale. And then when you exhale, the diaphragm actually relaxes, and so it moves back upwards like that. And that presses on your lungs and forces the air out when you exhale. So the diaphragm there is pretty cool. Let me zoom out here. And there is your sternum, your breastbone. So I'm going to do some dissection here. Be sure to review, all right, the thoracic cavity, remember. Bring my pen back up here. Oops. Your thoracic cavity, if you recall, all right, so this whole thing I'm highlighting there in red, everything on the inside there is in the thoracic cavity, but hopefully you guys remember that the thoracic cavity is divided up into a right and a left pleural cavity. And then if you remember, your heart is sitting in here, that is the pericardial cavity. And then everything between in here, between your right and your left pleural cavity is considered to be the mediastinum, just a review from earlier information. And then your heart is sitting there in the inferior portion of the mediastinum within the pericardial cavity. All right, so we want to erase all of that. Oops, erase all, go away. There we go. All right, so I'm going to do some more dissection here so we can see the heart and where it's located. So bear with me while I do some clicking. I'm going to get rid of those muscles too. Say goodbye to the lungs here for a second. I'm going to take off, that's the right lung and the left lung. All right, so there's our heart underneath. So your heart is sitting there in more or less in the center of your chest. A good portion of it is located a little bit more over there on the left side. So there's your heart. And you can see the numerous blood vessels in green. Those are lymphatic vessels, vessels of your lymphatic system. And then if you're looking in closely, all these, many of these little light pink structures there, like that one, and then over here you got pink. Those are bronchi and bronchioles. Those are little air passages that carry air into the lungs and distribute it throughout the lungs. And so we'll take a closer look at those shortly. Okay, but there's your heart, right there in the center. And then I want to draw your attention to some of the major blood vessels that connect into the heart that are located there on your listing. All right, so this big red one you see up here, everything that I've got highlighted there in blue, that is the aorta, which when your heart pumps blood, your heart has two jobs. It's going to circulate blood that is deoxygenated. It has given up its oxygen to your tissues. It has to pump that out to your lungs, and then the blood comes back from the lungs to your heart, and your heart now has to pump that oxygenated blood out to all parts of your body so that all all of your cells in your body can receive oxygen and nutrients and things that they need. So that blood exits the heart through that big artery. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and that one is called the aorta. If I rotate this around, let me highlight it over here as well. You can kind of see that is also the aorta. It is actually wrapping behind the posterior, posterior to the heart, and it also extends down into the abdominopelvic cavity. That's called the abdominal aorta. It's still the same big blood vessel there. And we'll take a look at that in more detail when we move on to the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, so let me deselect that one, and then let me draw your attention to a couple of big blue blood vessels here. We'll strip off some more of these muscles. All right, right there, highlighted in light blue, that is your superior vena cava. And what that is, veins, that is a major vein. It is bringing deoxygenated blood back from your tissues to the heart so that the heart can pump that out to the lungs where it can pick up oxygen again. So a lot of this blood that's coming from the head and the shoulders and the arms and so forth, it's carried by various veins that eventually lead to and empty into this big gigantic one called the superior vena cava, which then connects to this section of the heart over here on the right side of the heart. And then let me move down here and deselect that one. Now what about all of the deoxygenated blood? I'm going to hide the diaphragm that's coming upward from the abdominopelvic cavity, your legs and your feet, your hips and so forth, other areas. So there in light blue, you have a big gigantic vein into which a lot of that blood drains. And if you notice, right in here, it also connects into this right side of the heart. And that is called your inferior vena cava. And so those are really the only, for now, this part of anatomy, those are the only major blood vessels you've got to know. And those are connected to the heart, and they're pretty obvious. They're not too hard to find. All right, how about our esophagus? That's also there on the list. The esophagus, we took a look at that in the last lecture video clip. Let me zoom out a bit. And the esophagus, again, is the tube that is carrying food and beverages down to your stomach. So let me actually get rid of the heart here. So we're going to go posterior to the heart. Do you see this pink tube right in there? That's actually your esophagus. So I've got it highlighted in blue now. And oops, let me deselect everything. I'm going to strip off some other structures here so we can see it a little bit better. Hide all of those. Oh, I didn't even realize I'd highlighted the esophagus there. All right, deselect all. Go away. All right, so now you can see more of it exposed there. There's the esophagus. And if we move up higher here, let's strip off these muscles. Some of our blood vessels here. Hide those, go away. All right, now here is your trachea. That's your windpipe. And the trachea is anterior to the esophagus. So if I hide that, and all those little ring-shaped structures or cartilages that you have around your windpipe, you guys know you can actually feel those ridges on your windpipe. They protect it. All right, so there in pink, there's your trachea. So it's extending all the way from the pharynx, a tube that travels all the way down through the thoracic cavity on into your abdominopelvic cavity. That portion is not shown in this view here on visible body, and it's going to connect to the stomach down in here. And we'll see that again when we do the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, I'm going to pause for a second and bring up a different view so we can look up the rest of the structures here. Okay, this is a view of the thoracic cavity in which everything except for the skeletal system and the respiratory system have been removed. So that's going to let us take an easier look at the structures you need to know from the respiratory system in your thoracic cavity. All right, so as I pointed out before, right in there, that tube is your trachea. That's your windpipe. Just superior to that, you have your larynx, protected there by the Adam's apple, and then above that you have your pharynx in the back of your throat, and then just below there. So air is passing down that tube, and then of course you've got your two lungs here, your left and your right lungs. Those are pretty obvious. And I'm actually going to highlight the lungs and get rid of those so that we can see the air-filled tubes that are located within the lungs themselves. So they're going to go away. And so this is kind of cool now because that reveals in pink there, those are the air passages that extend to all the different parts of your lungs. And they're kind of like, it probably looks to you, sometimes this is called the bronchial tree because it really does look like a tree. So you've got these like bigger limbs and trunks that connect to smaller and smaller limbs, and eventually those lead to like little tiny twigs so that air gets distributed to all parts of your lungs. All right, and what I'm highlighting here in blue now, well, not that one, hang on, deselect all, let me get rid of the rib, that's a rib. I'll say goodbye to some of the ribs so I don't highlight those any further. All right, these larger air-filled tubes that I'm highlighting there, those are called bronchi, any of those. So air passes down your trachea, and it's going to, some of it's going to go left, some of it's going to go right. So you've got left bronchi and you have right bronchi. The singular form of bronchi is bronchus with a US on the end. All right, so I'm going to deselect those. And then notice, eventually you get into these, oops, get rid of that. Eventually you get into these really tiny twigs that contain air. The smallest little branches, air-filled tubes there, are called bronchioles if you're looking on your lab guide, your anatomy study guide. And then, so you've got to bring air out to all parts of your lungs, and then your lungs are going to do gas exchange. You're going to have an exchange of oxygen into the bloodstream, and then carbon dioxide gas is going to move from the blood into those little tiny air-filled spaces so that you can exhale it back out. All right, so I think that concludes the structures you need to know for the thoracic cavity.